The 2021 IBA report on mental well-being in the legal profession has cited the stressful nature of the work, intensive work time demands, poor work-life balance, and high levels of pressure as key factors impacting well-being in the legal profession overall. So with that, and with us to share their insights on this topic, we have 4 leading barristers. And I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to each before posing them some questions. First off, we have Haydee Dijkstal, a barrister practicing at 33 Bedford Row Chambers in London in international criminal and human rights law. She's also a US lawyer and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, a member of the EC of BHRC, and is chair of the International Criminal Court Bar Association's Victims Committee. Haydee's international law practice involves representation of victims, NGOs, accused persons, and governments before international courts, tribunals, and mechanisms, including the International Criminal Court, International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, Special Court for Sierra Leone, European Court of Human Rights, African Court and Commission, and UN bodies. We also have James Pereira, King's Counsel, practicing barrister at Francis Taylor Buildings, also FTB Chambers. He took Silk in 2014 and is an expert in planning and environmental law. He's also a certified professional coach and founder of the Libra Partnership. His coaching practice involves helping lawyers find greater capacity and resourcing by resolving unhelpful personal dynamics, learning and using new tools, and finding a place of greater strength to practice from. He also runs regular workshops on skills training, practice management, and solutions finding. You'll find more about the Libra Partnership at the link, which I hope that Louise will now put into the chat box. We're delighted also to welcome Aarif Abraham, who's a barrister, writer, and speaker based at Doughty Street Chambers. He specializes in international criminal law and public international law, including international human rights law and international arbitration. Aarif is the founder of the Accountability Unit, an NGO specializing in conflict resolution and justice issues. Most recently, he's advised on an initiative to create a special tribunal for the crime of aggression committed in Ukraine, was co-counsel and principal legal advisor to the Uyghur Tribunal, and founded the Yazidi Justice Committee. He originally qualified and practiced as a solicitor at Slaughter and May. And last but not least, I should say, Rachel Spearing is a barrister at Sergeants' Inn Chambers in London. She has a broad civil and criminal practice, which includes inquests and inquiries, public, regulatory, and disciplinary law. Rachel co-founded the Wellbeing at the Bar program in 2012 and led the profession's research, review, and leadership response. She's the director of Wellness for Law UK, a not-for-profit organisation supporting the bar, which she founded in 2016. She holds academic appointments in Australia and Singapore and has regulatory and safeguarding positions with the British Horse Racing Authority and the Football Association. So thank you and welcome to you all. So I'm going to start by saying that basically asking you to share your personal experiences or reflections, focusing on the emotional and psychological challenges that you face in your human rights work. How have you personally coped with the mental toll of this work? So I'm going to ask Aarif if you would mind starting us off.
Sure. Thank you so much, Aswini. And may I also thank Louise and the Bar Human Rights Committee for bringing us all together. As Aswini mentioned at the outset, anybody who works in the human rights field, whether that's domestic or international, has to grapple with the realities of working in environments which we as barristers do not control, whether that's the legal environment or the economic environment or the cultural, social environment. A lot of my work focuses on mass atrocity crimes or armed conflict or really serious violations of international human rights law internationally. And burnout, vicarious trauma, despondency, I would say, are very real for anyone that's affected, of course, survivors and victims, or by anyone who's proximate to situations such as armed conflict or mass atrocity crimes. But that burnout and trauma and despondency is also heightened by the reality of very limited avenues, whether that's structural or otherwise, for accountability and justice. So I would say that mental health and physical health of people who work in this field, including your clients who are survivors of victims, plus human rights defenders, they do have their mental health impacted upon and intensified by some also practical hurdles. And that's often acute lack of funding for people-centered accountability processes, the absolute primacy of realpolitik over justice, the breakdown of relationships between practitioners due to competition over limited resources, and also complicated power differentials, and sometimes even self-promotion at the expense of the cause. And obviously, those are things that I've experienced and I've obviously come across, and I've had colleagues or clients who experienced that. And with that experience, you do learn some lessons. And sometimes that you do obviously face yourself situations where you have anxiety. And I think you'd probably be doing it wrong if you didn't have some anxiety. And I tend to think that actually now on reflection, anxiety actually helps indicate that you require an adjustment in your approach. And so things I've done, and I can talk about it in some of the other questions, where I've adapted is I've learned, for instance, how to professionally distance from a client's cause, and doing that with some grace and empathy so far as that's possible. I've also tried to understand my own agency, my own, let's say, ability to influence the situation and my role in a particular case or a matter. And also I've tried to be more realistic with expectations, even with the ideal in mind. You know, many of us want to achieve accountability and justice for our clients. But of course, we've got to grapple with practical realities. And for each of those things I've mentioned, I can come back to that in perhaps the next question to do with resilience, perhaps.
Thank you so much. It's very, very useful introductory remarks. Haydee, anything to add?
Thanks very much. Yes, I'm very glad to be here. Thanks very much to the Bar Human Rights Committee for planning this. I'm so glad that this topic is being addressed, because it is indeed something that everyone that's practicing this area of law is going to encounter and should think about being prepared for. There really does need to be more of a discussion. So as to my own personal experience, I come to it as from a perspective where I'm representing oftentimes victims of international crimes and international human rights abuses. And oftentimes this is direct access. So I'm working one-on-one with the survivors and victims and their families as well of these violations. So when I was thinking about what kinds of ways I've been impacted, or what kind of emotional and psychological perspectives I've encountered in my work, I was thinking of two things. One would be, I think, what we often think of is the content of the case or the project that you're working on. So you're working on cases and projects that involve stories from your clients, from victims, from their families, from witnesses that are harrowing, very difficult, and also evidence that we review and that we analyze, whether that's documents, pictures, videos, that can be shocking and gruesome and can be heartbreaking on an individual level for your client and for those that you're working with, but also depressing on kind of a more existential level when you're thinking about what is the state of the world, and can be so difficult. So that, I think that's one aspect where I've encountered these kind of emotional and psychological tools. But the other one that I actually really struggle with is comes more from the relationship with the client. Oftentimes barristers work with solicitors that instruct and who will have more of a direct access to the client, but with international work, direct access with those clients is very typical. And so, when you have that direct access with the client, there's so much more than just the legal arguments. You're working with individuals who are anxious and nervous and scared and traumatized, who have difficulty trusting and have been through really terrible things, and also with their family members as well. So there's a lot more that goes into that relationship and building that trusting relationship. And managing their expectations, helping them through their anxiety. It includes calls in the middle of the night when they're stressed about things. That can be so difficult, and really the weight of the responsibility that you're taking on as an advocate for these individuals really can be felt. So just to the second about how I've approached it, I first want to say that to remember that, I'm speaking for myself in saying that these tips come from a place where I've definitely not always gotten it right. I think we are able to speak to this because we have felt that burnout or that emotional toll, and we've learned from it. And it's always a learning process. But two things I want to raise, there's so much to talk about, but just two things quickly is one is managing expectations with clients, making sure that they realize that you cannot guarantee a result. And the time that it takes for justice can oftentimes be a really long time. It's difficult for the clients to hear, but you just have to do it. And making sure that they know that you'll be there for them throughout the process, that you'll take those steps that need to be taken, and that you'll also explain the process to them so it's understandable and transparent. And the second thing that I've used to approach these difficulties is thinking very carefully about the way that we practice empathy. I think empathy is often talked about in these jobs as being so important, and it absolutely is. I don't think that you can practice human rights without having this empathy. It's the cornerstone of what makes us fully understand the context of the situation for our clients and how to delicately and sensitively handle their cases. But we must practice empathy and offer it in a way that does not internalize or absorb the pain of others, such that it's detrimental to your own well-being. So I can't stress enough that if you're not well, then you can't be the best advocate for your clients. So practicing empathy in a way that finds space to review the evidence in a caring way, but also an objective way where you can best and most professionally handle that. So I think a lot of what Aarif was saying about professionally distancing is quite similar. So I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you so much. I know we're going to talk more about that. So I'm just going to turn to Rachel next. What are your personal experiences, Rachel?
So I probably can add maybe a devil's advocate, slightly different perspective to some of those. I echo absolutely everything that has been already raised by my colleagues. But sometimes my personal experiences, apart from spending many years as a sexual offences prosecutor within the criminal bar before I came to human rights work, all of those risks, the vulnerabilities, the exposure, that we're going to talk a little more about secondary and vicarious trauma, but those risks of burnout are well documented in my journey, and obviously led to the initiation of the Wellbeing at the Bar experience, which has now put these things very firmly in the conversation. But in my particular role, where I'm often acting for the state, where I have the opportunity to deal directly with individuals who are accused and are responding to the claims that are brought, or the responsibility for managing the organisation or the individuals working within that organisation, whether it be a restrained death in an inquest or in a public inquiry, the behaviours of others who, over a course of time, have been injurious. That can be also very, very challenging for an advocate. And so what I find is that students will come into this work, will have an interest in human rights, and find themselves not always aligned with the work that they have found themselves undertaking. And so that of and in itself can sometimes be a challenge, and people forget. They see, of course, the importance of the activism and being aligned with the work that you're doing, and it's very rewarding when one is working in that space. But being barristers, we of course have the core codes of conduct, the cab rank principles, and we often find ourselves in challenging situations representing a client and having to discharge those professional duties and obligations in circumstances where you may not find complete allegiance personally with those professional issues that you're having to deal with. So I have found myself in many times in those scenarios, And what has motivated and helped my sense of service is firstly remembering and stepping back. So all of the context of Aarif's safeguarding procedures and Haydee's role, I consider it to be my professional identity. I'm stepping into that position in the same way that you put on the wig and the gown, and you assume a responsible role where you're undertaking those professional duties. I find a really high level of meaning and purpose in what I'm doing, because it's rare that as a barrister you have that opportunity to speak truth to power, to sit down with people and to talk about how they're going to deal with the evidence, to look at and to reflect upon the issues and the allegations that are being raised, and to remind themselves and to bring it back home as to if it's a public authority, the duty of candour, the duty of cooperation, the duty of giving honest accounts for things that have happened, maintaining public trust and confidence in the process. So I find that my safeguarding is, and what a lot of people from time to time have commented, that I'm dealing with some very, very difficult scenarios and responding to them. And that's what drives me, is finding that gratitude for being trusted with that burden, being empathetic and sensitive to how you're asking questions of people who have endured very, very difficult experiences where you may have to qualify or understand or test the credibility or the rationality or the extended aspects of those facts. But bringing all of that into my holistic work, I find that it's a balances, and I know we're going to come to resilience techniques yet next, Aswini. So that's my contribution, I think, for this moment.
That's very nice, and I can see the conversation opening up. James, I think you have a lot to add to this.
Thank you. So I'm kind of here with two hats on. I've got my bar practice, but I also work as a coach, and some of the workshops I do actually are for the victims of trauma. So people who have suffered child abuse or violence, descendants of Holocaust survivors, of war, immigrants. And so a lot of what I've learned about boundaries actually has and coping has been in the space of helping those sorts of people. But at the bar, I have suffered burnout, physical collapse, brushes with alcoholism, depression, all sorts of things, really through poor self-regulation and my own kind of personal patterns. This was about 10 years ago now, and I'm still here and thriving and doing well. So it's all a very positive story from my point of view, and it's how I got into the coaching work, to be honest, because it was helpful for me, and I wanted to pass that on to others. But in my bar practice, although I'm a kind of planning and environmental lawyer, certainly in my early days, I did a lot of gypsy work, which brings in human rights. And I was always for local authorities against the gypsies, and the stories at these inquiries would be awful. All of the things that you would come with homelessness and dispossession, and it really pulled against what my core values were, and I would wish to have lost all of those cases. But the way the system worked, certainly at that time, it was always stacked against the travellers and the gypsies. So I understand that pull in different directions. What I've learned, and I know we'll get onto it later, I guess the headline points are boundaries. Boundaries are really important. Trust in the system. In other words, knowing our own role and having trust that it's actually up to somebody or something else to make the decision. Leaning into professional values, really understanding what our role is and what it isn't, what the profession expects of us. Here's an odd one: humility. We have to hold. Barristers aren't generally regarded as being humble people, are they? But we have to have the humility to understand what's within our capacity and what isn't. And I guess allied to that is fate. We also have to have the humility to respect the fate of the client. We can't change. There's lots of things we can't change, and often when we think we can change them, it's when we start to get into difficulty ourselves. I know there are questions that align with these things coming up, so those are the headline points. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a very, and thank you for sharing those very personal experiences, because, you know, to learn from having experienced that yourself, I think puts you into a very well, from the point of view of those tuning into this webinar, it puts them into a very different space probably to actually hear that. And I think it brings us very well into the notions of resilience and coping strategies. And it's good not to talk about these things in too much of an abstract way, because, you know, what James has just said and what all of you have said really shows that each of you differently experiences it and has learned a coping strategy in a particular way. And none of it's abstract at all, actually. So one of the things also to draw from one of the earlier sessions that I wanted to add into the mix is that we talk about international crimes and, you know, terrible things that are happening in the world, but actually we've also heard that human rights starts at a very local community level, and these notions of resilience and coping, I'm sure you will all say agree, start in the domestic and local community sphere as well. They are equally applicable at every stage of your career and level of work. So with that slight, with that introduction, Aarif, I just wanted to turn to you on the topic of resilience and coping strategies. We're really looking at ultimately at practices that have helped you to maintain your resilience, and also strategies for dealing with sort of evidence and sensitivity of your client's situation. I know you feel strongly about this. I know you've written an article on resilience, which I hope Louise will now put in the chat so people can access it. So perhaps you just want to, you know, highlight the points that you would like to make on resilience and coping.
Thank you, Aswini. I mean, as James has just said, I think we can come at essentially the same destination when we talk about self-care, well-being, community care, but from different perspectives. And again, resilience is probably an area where each of us will have experiences, lived experiences that gives us a way of defining that and then responding to that. And Haydee also touched upon what it is to work in, let's say, the international sphere. So, you know, when we talk about mass atrocity crimes, we're talking about, you know, crimes affecting usually large numbers of people, genocide, crimes against humanity, and also war crimes. And of course, we as lawyers will come into that and represent clients at a late stage. But of course, the fact that that's happened and we've not prevented that, and we meaning our political and economic and other structures, is obviously problematic. And, you know, genocide doesn't happen overnight. It has a long process. It's rooted in systematic inequality and discrimination. And I think, Aswini, you touched upon that it's rooted in things that we touch, you know, other people, in the sense of we come across them, we might be discriminatory to them. And when you start to amplify that and dehumanize people, those environments start to create the conditions in which conflict and crimes happen. And that's the context in which I look at resilience with my work, because it's macro issues, huge issues beyond the control of a single person, and also micro issues in the sense of helping your immediate client and helping them achieve accountability. So for me, resilience is what I would say is an inward and outward orientation to the external world. And by that, I mean things within, obviously, my control, or and knowing, of course, as James has identified, whether something is or is not in your control is obviously a challenge in itself. But also things that are completely outside of your control, with which, you know, whatever you might do as an individual, which you can't impact. And I'd say the practices that have helped me kind of become resilient, and obviously it's a journey, you have ups and downs. I'd say that there are kind of 4 practices, and I outlined them in my article. And the first is recognizing the fluidity between idealism and pragmatism, and marrying the two to address existing situations of injustice. Second, it's appreciating that long-term systemic change by furthering the rule of law through practical democratic engagement has to go hand in hand with short-term daily struggles. So, your case is situated often in a much broader political, socio-economic context. And it's not just you. You need lawyers and journalists and politicians to align to make a difference. Connected to that is this early pitfall where I think people get into human rights work, they hurtle themselves into it, at breakneck speed without much planning. And of course, a lot of our work, it requires planning. It's painstakingly slow, it's drafting, it's interviewing, and it often critically builds on the successes and efforts of lots of other people. And then third and fourth, quickly, third is moving beyond a focus purely on the symptoms to confronting, of course, the root causes of dislocation and disillusion and despondency. So I often think about a lot of my work from a prevent perspective. How do we prevent these things from happening? How do we prevent harm from becoming worse, both for your client, for other lawyers, for the kind of bigger macro cause to ending genocide or conflict? And then finally, I think a really important thing is finding the space and time for yourself, in concert often with like-minded others, to cultivate what I call common virtues, which I think are not academic, that they emanate from deep human intuition or tradition. We know what it is to live well, and the question is, how do we both live well and try to make a difference and impact in our work for others?
Thank you, Aarif. Haydee, I'm going to come to you briefly because I know you've already talked about the managing expectations and so on, and I'm that sort of dovetails with a bit of what Aarif has been saying. Do you share his experience in that sense, and what else do you do in your work?
I think everything that Aarif has said is excellent and really important to remember. So thank you for sharing that, and I look forward to reading your article as well. I think when I'm thinking about resilience and how to keep going in the face of really horrific subject matters that we're addressing, and difficult odds also for your clients, and the time it takes to find justice. One of the things that I continue to come back to as kind of a foundational thing is remembering how much you're helping somebody and really having the pride in that work that you're doing. But also in remembering and helping somebody, it's not just about getting that ultimate win at the end, appreciating each of those small steps that really do help your clients and those, whether it's an individual, a community, an NGO, whoever you're acting on behalf of to try to get justice. So just, some of those small things, like just they have somebody that will truly listen to their story and listen to what they want to achieve as well. That there's somebody that they can trust to guide them through the process and make it more understandable and predictable. And I think one that's really important as well is that victims can have agency in the proceedings. So I'm thinking here about victim participation. And for example, with one of my cases, I'm representing some victims at the ICC, and they, I've managed expectations with them about how really long it's going to be before there's any chance of justice. And the chances are quite slim as well. But the fact that they've been able to make submissions to the judges in the process has given them the agency to feel like they're being heard on some level, that they're part of the process. So, internalizing those kinds of wins as well. And of course, if you do have, one of those bigger wins at the end, celebrate those, appreciate them. They don't come around all the time. Make sure that you don't take them for granted. So maybe I think that's one thing. There's so much more to talk about, so maybe I'll leave that for the other questions.
Yes, I know. I don't want to rush anyone because this is all very valuable. But I do want to turn to James, really, because James, you've talked about boundaries and again, the approach to difficult issues, but you've also talked about self-care issues, and I wonder whether this is now the time really to start moving into looking at your own experiences of dealing with
Sure.
difficult issues and the strategies that have worked for you, but also looking at the work that you do around self-care and the LawCare project that you've been involved in.
Sure. So here's a little model. And by the way, can I just endorse everything everyone said, and those who are attending. I attend lots of these things, and this one's very special. You won't know that, but what you're hearing so far is quite wonderful. Let me carry on. Here's a little model that I keep in mind. So if you imagine a continuum, this is one end of it, this is the other. We have receiving at this end, and we have giving at this end. And we all occupy a place along this, right? And most people who are at the bar and other helping professions, right, will feel more comfortable at the giving end. And they'll feel uncomfortable at the receiving end because we have a sense of virtue or purpose that's around giving, and we're not necessarily so good at receiving. But we need to keep these two things in balance if we're going to be well resourced to serve our clients. And in professional relationships, the exchange is money in exchange for service, right? That's a way of balance. You do more work, you get paid more, and so on. But that's what we see above the line. If we look below the line, we've got all our motives for helping. And of course, our motives for helping, we need them because that's what gets us out of bed in the morning. But we tend to get into difficulty when we mix in our own motives for helping with the client's deep needs. So, and this particularly happens if we have something in our own story or in our family story, maybe not our immediate family, it could be our ancestral family, which coincides with the need of the client. I'll give you an example of mine. My parents are both immigrants. My father came over from India. I had to cross-examine in a compulsory purchase case. We were trying to take away this land from people. And the person whose land we were trying to take was an immigrant who'd come over just about the same time as my dad. And I remember saying to my junior beforehand that my challenge in this is to put our case fully and strongly, even though in my heart I feel so much sympathy for this man's position. He'd named his hotel after his family. It was his stamp when they come over from the Middle East. So we have these places where our own biography coincides in some kind of values way with the client's biography. Those are the places where we've got to be really careful that we don't jump in with the client. We don't align our own fate and our own story with the client's. The way I sometimes put it to people is, you can look at the torrent of the river of the client's story, and maybe you can dip your foot in, and so you can feel it, so you can empathize, but don't jump in. When you jump in, you're lost. You can't help people from that place. You can only align yourself with them, but to help, you've got to have some distance. You've got to be able to step back. So I can't really teach people, tools in a few seconds of talking, but I can give some headline points. So I think body work is really important. You will know from dealing with traumatized clients that trauma gets stored in the body, and it gets stored in our bodies when we do difficult cases. We start to feel tense in our shoulders. We can feel our chest closing, all of those things. So having some body practice, yoga is a great example, exercise, great example. Having some mind practice, mind and body are the same, right? But just for the purpose of a conversation, we separate them. So meditation, really helpful. It can help compartmentalize, it can help building helpful pictures. We can build, I have a mind garden where I put different cases in different parts of the garden. And I know they're growing when I'm not there, but I can go and visit them and things. It's just a way of compartmentalizing. Other speakers have talked about, in effect, fate and humility, knowing what we can change and what we can't change. And sometimes things will hit us, and that's okay, right? It's okay to be pulled down. What's important is that we have a process to deal with it. We have a way of discharging it. We have a way of settling, being at ease with it, even though we're feeling it. We don't carry it around with us. Another thing that I've started doing really in my trauma therapy work, when I come out of a day's workshop helping people, you carry a lot, and I've got the model of a child that I now use. There's a story behind it which I won't go into, but I imagine the simplicity of a child, right? A well nurtured child, when they're told off, they're sad for a few moments, and that's the purpose of telling them off. But then they'll go and play again, and they get over it, and they don't dwell on it. And so I try and bring the model of the attitude of a child to the processing of the stuff I'm carrying. Just sit with it, process it a little bit, and then go off and play and get on to the next thing. And each of us will have metaphors or imagery that will work for us. But they might sound like tricks, but they're important. I'll say a couple more headlines. Having support groups, I think, is really important. Having mentors and mentoring conversations is important too. Groups like this are important. Rachel's done a huge amount of, I got into this having a coffee with Rachel after she wrote something for the Bar magazine. And there is a huge amount of support out there for people. I know we're coming on to resources later. I won't say anything else. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I was going to say, though, in terms of that resources, we don't have so much time, unfortunately. We should have had much more time. Would people be able to find out more about the things that you're talking about from the Libra Partnership link?
We do stuff, and we publish articles and so on. We've written about 70 articles for the Lawyer since 2016 in a series called Loving Legal Life, which if you Google and get onto the Lawyer, you don't need to pay for the subscription, you can access. LawCare, so I'm a LawCare champion. So LawCare are a mental health charity set up for lawyers. They run a confidential helpline, but they also have a ton of resources on their website.
So we should share that, shouldn't we? We should share that.
Yes, I don't have, it's something like, www.lawcare.org. So if someone could Google it and put it in the chat, that would be great. I know Rachel's will also be able to say a lot about resources. The Bar Council have their own resources. The Inns have a lot of resources too. But let me have Rachel.
I think I'm going to go then straight to Rachel on that, because Rachel, I know I was going to ask you about your own strategies, but given the time, I'd really like you to talk about the Wellbeing programme, because I think we're looking at what James has been talking about are obviously personal strategies, which are very, very important. But the Wellbeing at the Bar is more of a structural, organisational approach. Would that be right? And that's also very important.
Yes, I mean there's a whole range of work that has been done over the last 10 years, and just touching upon some of those resources. I've sent the link. I hope that Louise will see the email and pick up. Just following on from what James was saying about that continuum and knowing where you are. The first important pieces of work that I think were done about 5 years ago was starting to inculcate the awareness, so having the conversation and talking to those that are coming to the bar, the new students who join the Inns of Court. And I know many of the BPTC providers, I think there's a various experience in how detailed that is, but there are now more resources, and we are very much encouraging within practice development and practice management. So the Bar Wellbeing work is a portal, and the Bar are held on the Bar Council's platform. What I've just asked Louise to tweet is a fantastic 3-minute animation which combines everything that everybody's been sharing during this session. It talks about the basics. So firstly, it talks about the types of personalities. It's a wonderful animation done by Dr. Bill Mitchell, who's spoken very widely, is a clinical professional who's been engaged with researching and treating a lot of issues in this space. Dr. Bill Mitchell's animation explains where and how and why our personalities are drawn to the work, why that might make us vulnerable, what types of mechanisms and impact that can have on our physiology, on our minds, and on our work itself. But more importantly, he talks about what the antidotes to some of these things are, and it's the basics. It's sleep, it's diet, it's exercise, it's all of those holistic things coming together. And so with this piece of elastic, the first thing I would encourage and talk very much about, and what we're teaching in the new practitioner programs, is how to take your temperature. And that goes back to the understanding the Yertz-Dodson curve of where and how you're traveling up and down your stress and your resilience. and what that involves, and where and how those telltale signs for you begin to show. Having a handful of things to be able to respond to those in an antidote way. And again, I'm not going to repeat, there's lots of resources to signpost people to that.
Can I just ask you this? Because, you know, we're talking, there's obviously a lot of research. There's a lot of experience, individual, and lots of people like you, incredible people who are sharing your experiences. But we're really talking about, you know, walking this walk, not just talking it. And I think some people might have the impression that, you know, bar councils, I'm going to say in the plural, around the world, you know, are more about talking the talk. And you know, and there is still a resistance to this kind of cultural change because there's still stigma attached to saying to your colleague, I'm really suffering with this case. I can't read this, and I can't sleep. I can't go to court tomorrow. You know, that is still a really difficult thing. I know even today for people to say. How is that being changed?
Well, we have a huge amount of work being done. I absolutely agree that we must never let up on that. The reality is that all of the specialist bar associations have a leadership engagement in this. There are excellent sets of chambers. Many of those who are represented here today have very active programs within their chambers. We're alive to the fact that, sadly, there is a high risk and a high degree of risk to our work when you're working in this space. It can affect your quality of life, even your professionalism, if you become unwell, if you're exposed to these risks. And so I think dealing with it in the sense of a hazard and understanding and or those around us, and certainly the colleagues, the bar, I think, is well reported to be a very collegiate place. Of course, there are challenges in a system too, but actually we are getting much better. And I regularly talk to lots of people, whether it's just because they know I'm a positive advocate and I'm a magnet in roving room, but even individuals who might be appearing against me in cases. We are constantly checking in with each other. We are constantly being considerate. Or those in a leadership role, I think, I'll give you an example. Led juniors in a recent case explained that I was going to be putting boundaries on a working time and how we would be directing requests and sitting and managing family and caring responsibilities around the very challenging nature of the work that we were doing in that case and why that was so important. And I did meet resistance from the tribunal's perspective, but explaining that and why there was a business case and how it was about optimising people and keeping people safe in that challenging space was then widely understood and very gratefully acknowledged by others. So I think we just have to keep making those steps. And those that are joining this profession, what I'm also experiencing is a reverse mentoring, that they have and should have an expectation of their leaders. They're coming to the students' events and they are talking more openly. And sometimes that is challenging for those at the other end of the profession in their careers who hadn't spoken about it. But I think over time, it's these incremental gains and it's the expectation to have continuing professional development and managing and learning around that, whether it's coaching or whether it's bringing people in. I'm just about to do a piece of work with secondary and vicarious trauma. I know we're going to come on to that, but there are fabulous sharing and resources through lots of agencies. We just need to be making better connections to and with amongst our profession, because we're self-employed. So I think if the bar sometimes has its drawbacks from that organisational perspective.
Yes, well, do feel free to say something about secondary and vicarious trauma if you would like to do so now. But it the idea is, from what I understand, it really as early career professionals and as young people come into the profession, it's the demands that they make as well that are going to change the culture in terms of what you're saying. Yeah.
I think absolutely, and I think these are incremental gains when we look back at practices and systems and structures that were in place 25 years ago when many of us may have been starting our careers. Certainly, we've seen those changing in lots of different positive ways, but it does take time. So secondary and vicarious trauma, I think, is what all of us are very alive to in the work that we do. And it's a very important issue for everybody who's working in that space. Secondary and vicarious trauma are slightly different things, but generically, the work of working in a human rights space and touching upon meeting people directly or indirectly and considering the material that we have to sometimes review as part of our professional obligations, it is the exposure to that trauma, the traumas that have been experienced by others, that then can affect us in ourselves. And James's very helpful analogy of where and how our own journeys may make us vulnerable to those aspects also exists. And we know that many excellent people who work very passionately in these causes and work areas may have had their own lived experiences of some of these issues, either as refugees or as people who have been displaced or in different ways. And so that actually can also make them passionate and powerful advocates for these issues, but it can also predispose them to potential vulnerability. So secondary and vicarious trauma is something that we are now talking more openly about. What is it? It is not the catastrophic event like post-traumatic stress when people might have had a car crash and experiencing that directly themselves. It's that slow drip often of being exposed to people and individuals where that work or those events or seeing that material can really begin to grate upon us and affect how we behave. And so that's really what it is that exposure. What causes it is often it's a very complicated phenomenon. So I'm not going to spend the limited time we've got talking about what causes it. Most importantly, I want to talk about the effect and the effect. How do you know if you're affected? It is not a very easy thing to immediately recognise, but it can very much begin to affect your sleeping, your resilience and the bandwidth of your patience. You can feel startled, alerted. Your anxiety levels can begin to be fearful. Your reactions and that rescue mentality and these risks that Aarif has been talking about, maintenance of boundaries, you can feel like you can never do enough. So effectively, you become ingrained, as Haydee says, in these cases. You become very committed to an outcomist, and you lose those professional boundaries. And so you can really feel that actually it's a very slow effect of withdrawal, tiredness, a lack of motivation, of feeling very jaded with the work that you're doing. You begin to avoid certain scenarios. You become less connected with the positive things. So people talk about withdrawing from their friends and the happy environments that used to lift, because they are more connected to that negativity and being trapped in that space.
That's really brilliant, and because it sort of brings it all together in a way, because we've already been talking about the coping mechanism and the need for resilience, and that's one of the things that one needs to guard for in relation to secondary trauma and vicarious. I mean, whatever it's good that there's a label, but it's a sort of slow accumulation of events or work that can lead to something. They may come and take you by surprise, presumably. You may not realize that's happening, and it happens. But I just wanted to say that we are now we've got 10 minutes left, and I did want to give people a chance for questions. We have one question, but what I'm going to do is this. I hope this isn't too difficult. We've got one last question. I was going to ask people to offer those who are watching, law students, early career practitioners, on advice on building resistance and prioritizing their mental being as they come into the profession at the outset of their careers. In doing so, there's one question actually which is about the urgency of work and the need for self-care and the urgency when you've got urgent work, things that need responding quickly. How do you protect yourself in that situation as well? So I'm going to throw that into the mix, if I may. It's not too difficult to do, but ask you each then to offer your final tips. Aarif first, your advice.
Thank you, Aswini. I think it's a really good question, partly because it goes back to where we kind of started, about what's within our capacity and control, and where do structures and systems and external need and external need and the agency of your clients come into all of this? Because the question is, why is it that practitioners are in this situation in the first place? Why are we putting our physical or mental health at risk? So I actually have a critique of really the institutional responses. It's not to criticize the institutions themselves, because as Rachel's outlined, practical wellbeing initiatives are really important at an individual level. If you've got mental health, physical health problems, you want help, and that's completely understandable, and those programs should be put in place. But actually what we're talking about are still individualized, compartmentalized, and commercialized notions of self-care. We're just looking at the symptom. After you get sick, you're going to get some help, or you're trying to prevent yourself getting sick. But actually, what are the incentives and disincentive structures that create that? And I think a lot of it is with us as practitioners, that we self-sacrifice, we self-abnegate, and we do that because we've somehow told ourselves that it's not acceptable to be paid for your work, or it's not acceptable to get a little bit of recognition, or it's not acceptable at a societal level to expect some material rewards for what you do. And therefore you then do push yourself into these positions saying, oh, it's that urgent piece of work, I'm the only person that can do it. You probably are as well. And the question is, why? We're the 6th richest economy in the world. And I think there's this fear that by saying that, you're politicizing this issue. And I say, well, quite rightly, because it is a political issue, and we need to get to addressing the root causes. So I'd say, take the urgent case, but think about, what is the systemic problem here? And shouldn't we, as a profession, come together to say, some things are no longer acceptable from a generally self-care, but also community care perspective, because that's what this issue is. It's broader than ourselves.
That's very helpful indeed. And I resonate with pretty much everything you've said there, Aarif. Haydee, last words, please. We've got 6 minutes left.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said, Aarif. Thanks for raising that. Just a few points that I had meant to come to, and just to echo what other people have said as well, try to switch off daily. We're living in a world right now where there's so much content on social media that's just overwhelming amount of content, thousands and thousands of videos that might be in similar nature to the work that you're doing, can be quite triggering. As hard as it is, don't scroll, try to create that separation, put the phone down. Definitely agree with taking breaks, go for walks when you feel like it's starting to be too much, just pause, even if it's for 10 minutes, get out of the house. Especially when a lot of us are working from home now, and that can be quite isolating. Personal time, exercise, yoga, mindfulness, time with family, and definitely agree with creating a network. I think that's so important, especially at the bar, where often we're working by ourselves, and a lot of people aren't going into chambers. You're not encountering your colleagues quite as often. But the one thing that I did want to say is about boundaries, which has been brought up before. And I think we often talk about them, but they're so much practically, they're so difficult to actually, especially when you're starting out in your career, to implement those boundaries and to feel the confidence to assert those boundaries when and in that balance of situations being urgent, and so that you're needed, but you also want to protect your well-being as well. So remember that there's a balance. Remember that it's going to be a push and pull. Sometimes you're going to have to be more flexible. You need to keep the best interest of the client in mind. So you might have to be more flexible. Other times you can be more firm. It's going to be different for different cases, for different times in your career. So just remember that balance. Try to maintain a practice of boundaries from the start, but also they can be done in a professional way. I think sometimes when people think about boundaries, it's about saying no, but you can do that in a professional way where you don't do it at the last minute, where you plan with the people that you're working with, so that you can still meet the urgency of the case. You can plan ahead, and it's not disadvantaging the client, but then you also get the space that you need. So I think that's where I'll start.
Thank you so much, Haydee. James, your last bits of advice.
Sure. In a nutshell, to directly answer the question, you can't meet the urgency of every urgent case. You just can't do it, right? So you have to make sure we can only help well if we're well resourced, and we can only do the last minute or the things that really call upon our time if we're well resourced at the point that we go in to connect with the case. So we have to look after ourselves generally and not in a reactionary way. And then we can pick and choose and step in where it's appropriate. Aarif said something, Aarif said lots of very wise things. And one of them was that there's an outer orientation and there's an inner orientation, and they're two sides of the same coin. And I would urge people in relation to the inner orientation, which personally I think is the most important, because that's how we get the good outward orientation. That if you have any kind of major stories in your family biography, to be just mindful and watchful of them. And if there are things in your work that keep sticking to you, lingering with you, then that's the place where you need to attend to your own internal self. And I guess the overall target is to put things where they belong. Put your own trauma and your own experience where it belongs, which is nothing to do with your client, and then you can better make space for your client. And then finally, Aarif said something about the idea that it's not acceptable to be paid for this work, or it's not acceptable to take thanks. That's the receiving end of this dynamic, and sometimes we think we're giving too much and we're over giving, but actually what's happening is we're just not open enough to receiving, and we need to redress the balance by, when people say well done, great job, don't say, oh, it was nothing. You say thank you. You acknowledge it, and we can fill ourselves appropriately in that way. When we're paid, don't have any shame in being paid to do what's worthy work. It's the reward, and be grateful for it, and then we can help people from a place of strength rather than a lack of capacity. Thank you.
Wow, incredibly good words, sorts of things that I wished I'd heard 30 years ago. And also, the power of saying no to the urgent case as well. Sometimes you've just got to say no, and that's okay, because somebody else will do the work if it's that urgent. So remember that, say no. Rachel, I'm going to give you literally 30 seconds.
3 things. Nothing will work unless you do. You must fit your own oxygen mask first before you can help others. And so if you take on board all of the lessons of looking for this information and make it part of your essential practice management, it is not a fluffy thing. It will optimize your performance. It will make you a better lawyer. It will keep you thriving and in the good place, enjoying and loving what you do and being there to do your important work for others.
Thank you so much, everyone. Can I say I've personally found this very inspiring. Even in my senior age, I found, nuggets of wisdom that I can still hold on to and will help me in the future. And I hope that goes for everyone who's been listening today as well. These are very wise words indeed, and will stand you in very good stead. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone, and I'm going to pass on to the next session, which is going to be chaired by Shweb. And I see, Shweb, you're there, ready and waiting. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye from this session.